Oshkosh Common Council. This time we will be talking about a classification and compensation study update. With that, I will turn it over to Fritz.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you.
And we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this project tonight. As some of the council members that have been here for a while know, we take a look at our non-represented employees really about every 3 years. Now, since our pay structures are mixed, we look at the public sector as well as the private sector, so we can keep pace and make sure we're on track. And over time, HR is continuously tinkering a little bit with the pay structures to make sure that we can recruit and retain employees. And in the intervening years, so we want to make sure that somebody else takes a look at it and make sure that we're on track and synced with the marketplace. So that's what we were fortunate enough to have Patrick Lynn do. He works for Carlson Detman Consulting and also Cottingham Butler right now,
Yeah,
Patrick?
I'll explain that in just a moment here.
So thanks again for helping us with this project. I guess I'll just turn it over to you and you can guide us through this.
Well, usually these meetings are a little bit more dramatic, or whatever you might want to call it. But I think tonight's findings, you'll find that it's relatively stable. I don't know if that's a good thing in your eyes or not, but I think from a financial standpoint, not having to upend everything, is probably good news for the time being. But as John alluded to, that we are Carlson Detman Consulting, a division of Cottingham and Butler Insurance Services, that as of July of this year, we made the transition. We were acquired by Cottingham and Butler. And what we found as we were looking for, what the next chapter of Carlson Detman looked like, is that when we did our compensation projects, and it made perfect sense since it's part of our process, that we would get asked lots of questions about employee benefits. And our response typically would be, we know benefits, but we don't do benefits. And Cottingham Butler, as we found out as we partnered with them on a project earlier this year, that they did benefits, and they got asked a lot about compensation, but they didn't do compensation. And so this marriage, if you will, made perfect sense in terms of kind of rounding out both of our services and being able to kind of fully address many of those issues. When we talk about compensation, in reality, we talk about total compensation. And so that's kind of, the path we went down effective July 1st of this year. Met a couple of you in the past, but my background very quickly is I drove around the lake today. I live in Chilton. My lifelong dream is to drive across the lake if I get enough guts during the winter time.
Come on, it's easy.
If not, we have a nice service.
Take a
yeah.
50-minute drive and turn it into something shorter or much longer,
A lot of people
depending on the weather.
Talk to your insurance folks about that drive.
There you go.
Yeah.
But I spent 19 years of my career working in county government as a human resources director, the last 13 of which were in Calumet County. And then I've been with Carlson Detman the last 5.5 years doing consulting work for them. And Charlie, as he bounces back and forth between Wisconsin and New Mexico, servicing clients, but also from residence purposes, felt it was time for me to take over the Oshkosh portion of his book of business. A portion of the presentation tonight is just to kind of begin to outline the things that we're seeing in the marketplace. I think that you probably hear a lot of this from your departments or in your other capacities, but some of the things that we talk about and are dealing with is a shifting marketplace. And we're seeing some things in the marketplace that we haven't seen either in a long time or ever. And I'll talk about a couple of those. But when we deal with a shifting marketplace, in some situations we're finding the market is moving faster than our own surveys or other surveys can keep up. And it certainly is a challenge for certain positions and certain classifications. Nursing being one of those prime examples where trying to keep up with the Joneses is all but impossible in this day and age. We have a workforce that's aging like we haven't seen before. The largest generation that this country has ever seen, I think the world has ever seen for that matter. I think the number is 10,000 baby boomers per day are reaching the age of retirement. And it's putting a tremendous pressure on our workforce, especially in the public sector, as the public sector has gotten lean and mean over the course of the last decade or so. finding those replacement bodies, especially to move up the ranks, is becoming more and more challenging. And that next generation coming in, there are certain aspects of that, whether it's from a managerial standpoint or from a recruitment and retention standpoint, they have different expectations. And just as I will guarantee you, a few decades back when the boomers entered the workforce, there was differences in the workforce that were grumbled about. I know that there were people grumbling about the darn Generation Xers, as we were entering the workforce. And it's just going to continue. But there are different expectations and different pressures and that employers have to respond to. One of the slides, and in fact I have an updated version I just updated this week, that we keep track of. And this was based off a Wall Street Journal article that we borrowed from a couple years ago. They use national data. We like using Midwest. That's where we tend to operate, and I think it tells a different story, similar but different. On the two gray bars you see on there are the periods of the last two recessions we saw. That the blue line representing the number of voluntary quits in the workplace or in the workforce, and the red line indicating the number of layoffs. And what you can see, and I can speak since I do this graph myself, this gap is as large between the number of people quitting versus being laid off as since they've started collecting the data in the early 90s. That a factor of, after the last recession, people kind of either stuck to the jobs that they had or took whatever jobs were available to them, based on loss of job or shrinking labor market. And now people feel much more comfortable, whether it's for better pay, better opportunity as it relates to promotions or living closer to home. But as that gap grows, it puts increasing pressure on the wage market. And it's similar to that, with the housing market. That it's a seller's market now, and the same thing right now. It's an employee's market, and so trying to keep up with that is also putting pressure on your departments and your organizations.
Well, I assume that when you say voluntary quits, that means retirements versus I've had it, I'm done.
Retirements are a separate
What is?
item that they track. I'm done. I'm moving on to my next job. Yes, that's a good question though. The other piece, and this is just kind of reinforcing. This is from the Pew Research Center, and this is just kind of showing how the workforce is trending. You can see the boomers are beginning to exit the workforce as planned. I believe when I entered the workforce in the mid-90s, there was lots of conversations about the boomers going to retire someday. Well, now we're seeing it, and you can see that the millennials now, as of 2017, are the largest component of the workforce. So why do we spend so much time talking about them? Is because they are the largest component of the workforce, and there are certain things that are going to have to change to be able to address their expectations. As it relates to the city itself, there are two analyses that we do. I mean, there's many analyses, but when it comes to demographics, that begin to tell a story for an organization. The first one is the age profile. So this is the age profile, I believe, for the entire city,
Or the
or
non-represented.
non-represented group.
295 is just non-reps.
Okay, thank you. And the reason why I asked that question is because if we were to include police and fire, these numbers would likely come down a little bit. They tend to be younger, just by their demographics, but you're sitting about 42% of your workforce at or over the age of 50. That's a big number. I will tell you that in general, our public sector book of business, we usually see that number hovering around 50%. It's trending downward a little bit only because we're seeing more retirements occurring. But, with retirement age being 55, 57, depending on the group, depending on your number of years of experience, that we use the age of 50 as kind of that indicator where people at least have retirement on their radar. The question of, do I have enough saved? What's my health insurance situation? Because even though being eligible to retire, say, for example, at age 57, being able to retire is a different question. And so we're not trying to make any supposition, but from a human resources standpoint, this is at least telling us that you're going to have some significant recruitment activity in your organization in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is a common tale that we see everywhere. And again, a little bit lower, so I suspect you probably have had a little bit of a wave of retirements in the last few years, and it's just going to continue into the foreseeable future. The second thing that we look at is the years of service. So the first side of the equation, or the first thing we look at, the age being, what's your recruitment outlook, this one is what are your retention challenges? And here, I would say that you're probably right in line with what we observe in the workforce, about a third of the workforce with less than 5 years of service. But then that also begs the question, what is being done or, as an organization to help retain these employees? It's our theory, and someday there will be data to prove it, but I think once you have an employee for 5 years, the likelihood of you keeping them even longer than that increases quite a bit. That they've settled into the organization, perhaps they have accrued benefits where it would be disadvantageous for them to leave the organization. And so again, with a third of your workforce with less than 5 years of service, and even though we're talking about this in the venue or in the lens of compensation, there are many other factors that play into that decision. The relationship with their supervisor, the workplace climate and environment, and all of those sorts of factors. But again, the reality being that, it's in addition to having a chunk of the workforce that might be eligible for retirement in the foreseeable future, you can't take your eye off the ball as it relates to keeping the employees that you have within the organization. So again, that begins to tell the story of what we look at. In terms of what we do with these projects, just a quick primer as it relates to some of the things that we have done and continue to do as a company, that we focus on 4 main components in terms of having a successful project. The internal equity piece, how do positions compare to one another within the organization? I know there's a lot of time that's spent making certain that we're not leapfrogging one group of employees over another, and and certainly the original study back in 2012, there was a great deal of conversation that went along with that, as well as, and really the primary piece of this particular project is the external competitiveness. How are you measuring up with the outside world? Using a methodology that doesn't really change all that much. The variables change, the comparable employers, the mix of the employers, the surveys, and the jobs, but the methodology behind the scenes doesn't. And then especially in the public sector, the one thing you have a leg up on the rest of the world is that you have built-in transparency. We're sitting here on live TV, talking about this sort of thing. The final product is open record. Individual employee compensation is open. So again, that transparency piece is kind of built into the equation, but again, communication is king in today's world. And when we work on these projects, there are, we say 4 essential policy questions. There's really 3 main questions, and the 4th one becomes kind of a practical reality, and that is, what is that market of comparison? And this time through, we use the exact same market that we used in 2012, again with the 2016 update, and then today. And so again, it's identified in the report, so I won't go through that in exhaustive detail. Where do you want to be in that marketplace? What's that market placement? And again, the general philosophy of the city is that to peg the compensation structure at the 50th percentile or the average market. Not going to pay too high, you're not going to pay too low. Hopefully you will land someplace right in the middle to be able to be competitive, and then offer a sufficient range of pay, especially on a performance basis, to allow more competitiveness as employees move through that structure. So again, that design, what type of a plan, how do employees receive increases into the future. And if we were talking about a revised compensation structure, that's usually where a lot of the oxygen gets taken out of the room, and that how do you implement? How do you afford that sort of a structure? And again, we're not necessarily talking about that this evening. So just a quick overview in terms of our observations with this particular process. The first thing is making sure that we review and analyze the benchmark jobs. I should have this number off the top of my head. I don't. I believe last time we had 45 benchmarks. This time through, we have 47 that we were able to procure from the marketplace. Just had better data, and actually we've improved our software capabilities to better match market jobs. But by and large, we don't see any huge variance. This is an analysis of those 47 benchmark jobs in your current pay practices. And we're using the control point as that measurement. So it kind of takes tenure and seniority out of the equation, and we're looking at that market rate. So again, relatively good consistency.
Is that market rate, mean in the middle, is that like the middle of their salary structure? They started down here, they worked their way up several years, and now they're here, and then when they get to the upper tier, then
So your structures has,
Because we have step grades.
right, you have steps for the first half to a control point. So we're using the control point as that measurement for that individual job. And then we're not using the merit range for comparison purposes. And when we look at other organizations, we're looking at their midpoint, or if they have a complete open range, that we're trying to find that measure of central tendency, somewhere between 4 and 6 years of service to have an apples to apples comparison. Went too far. So the one thing that we look at, I know we referenced it in the last report and this one as well, is the compa ratio. The comparison of the current rates of pay versus the midpoint or the control point of that grade. And really, you're doing exactly as should be expected. That as people have more experience with the organization, they're gonna earn more money, especially if their performance continues at an acceptable level. And so you can see all the way down to the end, the less than 5 years of service, this is exactly what I was expect to see. And as we indicated in your report, you have very good discipline in hiring employees at or near the bottom of the pay scale and allowing them to progress through. And I think, probably the exceptions based on our conversations is if somebody brings tangible skills or education to the table, you're gonna elevate them. But again, sitting at 92.9, you're exactly where you should be from that standpoint.
We hire at 87.5 generally, so 92.9 is about 3 years. So
Yeah, and I did take a peek. I kind of expanded that when I did the first analysis, and I think your hiring rates are pretty darn close to the 87.5, maybe between 87.5 and 90%. So
a couple of times we've had to go above steps 2 or 3 for some of these starting positions.
if you're hiring in the first 25% of your range, you're doing really well. So again, kudos to the city for maintaining that discipline. The next graph is the exact same 47 jobs, the exact same job evaluation scores for those jobs. The only thing that we swap out on this particular graph is the market rates of pay instead of your current rates of pay or your current midpoints. And what you will see when I flip to the next slide here is you can't tell the difference between those two lines.
There are 2 lines there.
Yeah, and in fact, they asked me to make them distinctly different colors. One was black, one was gray, and it was like, when you make them different colors, only so we can see them, you still have a hard time seeing the differences. Now, when I present these lines, I think it's important that this is a measure of overall health. You may have a job here or there that one's above, one's below, but on the whole, you're dead on the market. And we have a couple jobs where we have a recommendation to address some inequity that we feel is crucial or much more immediate. And so let me just dig into that.
Before we go too far from that, just if we could go back to that, I think, Patrick's been very kind to talk about, HR and what we've done and all these sorts of things. But, I think these lines are a credit too to the council and their support of across the board increases that are synced to the marketplace. So the council's been very supportive of our ability to maintain our place in the market. And that's really aided us in maintaining this position and trying to make sure that when we're paying someone, those pay rates are valid and they're validated. So that's very much appreciated.
I know you have a working committee that you work with on some of this stuff. Do you share all this information with them and then, so they can take it back to their people?
We don't
Because
have
sometimes we get.
we don't have a compensation committee.
We don't. Okay.
No.
The health, we do the health.
The health
Yeah, the
insurance
health-
committee, we
okay.
do,
All right.
right?
But I did share the preliminary results at a virtual meeting.
Yeah,
with
because you
employees.
said you had a virtual meeting. Not
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and so we shared that with them, and we didn't get into the details that Patrick's ready to talk about. We've referenced that there were some areas that we were gonna get into, but when you do a virtual meeting, we can get a whole bunch of questions, and we didn't wanna start answering, well,
Right.
let's talk to, Deb in finance and see where she is. That would have been too personal. but
Right,
we talked in general.
I'm thinking more of just, the general wealth that the employee knows that we're competitive and, with other communities.
Yes, I think
And
they do know that.
I guess that's the key thing.
I think they do know that.
Because I know when we went to this, that was always concern of the employees that we heard from as a council, that how are we gonna compete with other municipalities?
Right, absolutely. And they do talk to us on a variety of different subjects related to this all the time, so.
Okay.
Patrick, one question. All we're hearing about is from every sector of the state, almost the whole country, that we can't find employees, can't find employees, can't find employees. now. So what impact will this shortage of employees have now and in the future when jobs, we don't need that many employees? What's that going to do to the compensation study
You know,
today and
I just had
5 years from now?
I had a conversation last week with a county that they have a nursing home, and their challenge is finding nurses and CNAs. I mean, that's the primary concern. And one of the conversations is that counties in general are aging. I mean, our entire population is, and the need for nursing home care is significant. And so, finding nurses and getting the necessary nurses in the education pipeline and so on and so forth, that at some point, the exact conversation, at some point, fast forward 20, 25, 30 years, you're going to have presumably, a glut. But the part of the problem is that there's just as many nurses retiring. They're part of that demographic as well, trying to fill that void. That I think you fast forward 10, 15 years, you're going to start to have those conversations. I alluded to earlier that when I entered the workforce in the mid-90s, there was, okay, what are we doing to prepare for the baby boomers when they decide to retire? I suspect at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, that conversation is going to be, what are we going to do when all of a sudden all these positions we staffed up, or all these occupations we staffed up for to deal with our aging workforce, and the aging workforce is no longer there? I mean, because it's so far out, I think they're talking 25 to 30 years, that they call it the silver tsunami, that's going to continue to ride out. That I think that's a legitimate conversation to have. I think in terms of finding the employees, we're seeing that right now with the Amazons and the Walgreens of the world. They just made announcements recently in the media as it relates to pay, moving to $15 per hour. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the tail end of this, because I think that that's going to be a concern as it relates to your wage schedule, and kind of as we forecast 3 years out for us, potentially doing an update or a redo of the project.
Right.
That's one of the things we have on our radar, is what's happening with that lower end of the wage schedule.
I think additionally, we talked about the council support for across-the-board wage increases this last cycle, and in the strategic plan, the fact that the council allowed us to split Courtney's job and have additional resources that we could dedicate to not only staffing but organizational development, so we don't continuously have to go outside our organization to get employees, so we can focus on providing opportunities to develop our own employees. I think that's going to be huge for us, and we very much appreciate that foresight by the council too, because I think that'll be very helpful for us moving forward.
And the greatest competition we see right now is in the management, supervisory, professional, and management ranks. And so if you can grow your own talent there and worry about backfilling with your entry-level type occupations, you're well ahead of the game.
Speaking of that point, just curious, as you were working on this study and looking at market information, and as we consider that kind of succession planning and in-house building, were you looking at anything to do with gender pay equity amongst positions?
I know we look at that, and usually it stands out like a sore thumb, when it does exist. And I've had projects here and there where I've had to make recommendations to make certain that the ship was righted, so to speak. I didn't see evidence of that here, and part of that is because with our job evaluation system, there's nothing in there that really would relate to, being biased towards one gender or one race or anything of that matter. So when you look at that and making certain that you have, and when you look at things such as education experience required to do the job, thinking challenges, decision making, work environment, that those factors kind of erase those other outside influences. And having gone through this exercise now, this is your third time through, kind of looking at that, I don't want to say it never would exist, and there's always that potential, but I'm not seeing anything that's just jumping off the page that would look at that.
Normally in government jobs, most of the jobs, say you're a patrolman, your salary is XYZ, whether you're male, female, Asian, Caucasian, whatever. Or if you're a police captain, your wage is XYZ, no matter what your race or any of that, because it's the salary of the position.
It's a salary of the position. I think, riding the wave, right after, and I hate talking about this, by the way, but right after Act 10,
Right.
that because you would have some groups where they were really good at bargaining, and the other groups, were maybe a little bit more passive in bargaining. And I'm not saying anything about gender, but every once in a while you would see that would be one of the factors that would come up that would lend credence to that sort of thing. So kind of going through and erasing those boundaries and looking at the jobs and the content of those jobs tends to neutralize some of those concerns. In fact, we just did a project recently in Minnesota where it's required, that you have that testing. And one of the things that, in talking with the council and with their attorney, is with the job evaluation system that we employ, and there's many job evaluation systems out there, is that they had a high degree of comfort that there wasn't bias kind of built into the system itself. So I mean we can run, and I think that's one of those things that as we tool up, we can run a separate regression analysis. But I think if we were doing so, we want to make certain that we are looking at all of the jobs completely fresh. I know that's one of the things we're talking about next time through.
Right.
And then do that analysis. Again, I wouldn't expect anything to jump off the page, but I've also been wrong before, and I've been surprised before. So we can take that into consideration.
Okay.
I just want to make sure if there's any other questions. I want to make sure.
In the interest of time, we
Yep.
ought to get
Okay.
cut to the chase.
So in terms of, one of the major observations we have is that whenever we do a project, the 2 or 3 areas that tend to have wage compression, 2 of them that you have here at the city, police and fire, that as employees have those opportunities to promote within the ranks, one of the challenges being that if your people that you're supervising are earning more than you, it certainly places you in a position where, do I want to promote? And when we designed the structure back in 2012, we did so on a much more compact basis, meaning that there, in probably our more recent studies, we would probably have a vacant grade here or there and some more spacing. That's one of the things I think we've kind of got it on our radar to address next time through. So instead of putting the pedal to the metal, we looked at the observed market data, and based on that, and based on the compression challenges that you're currently facing, trying to get people to promote from one level of the police and fire departments to another, is recommending, so for police captain, creating a J.5, basically an average of grade J and grade K. For your assistant police chief, assistant fire chief, recommending creating a K.5, which is just the average of K and L, which lines up almost exactly with the market data. So again, we're not going too fast, too quickly, but still being able to address some internal compression concerns that you have, where some significant questions, though, again, whether or not people would choose to promote through the ranks.
Right, and I think what it does is it positions us well in the meantime, until we can completely analyze all positions and all pay ranges. As Patrick talked about, after Act 10 and 32, we consolidated probably 60 pay ranges into 12 to 15 pay ranges. So there's a lot of condensed classifications in there. What I think will happen, and I don't want to preempt what Patrick or someone else may do when we do the full-blown study in 3 years, I think that there may be more stratification that might be recommended to account for the nuances of positions where we have several different kinds of classifications in one pay range. There may be more pay ranges, so we can just account for that and those nuances of the job.
Towards the bottom, the difference between the grades is pretty significant, and that's really what struck me. And we won't go to 60, but we certainly, 12 is probably not enough. And this is adding really just 2. But this is more at the higher end. It's going to be towards the lower end that we may need to take a look at that, because some of the entry-level positions, as they grow, is there a justification to ratchet those up? And there's a good sizable difference, just dollar-wise, between these pay grades. So there's justification.
And I know
to look at that.
Patrick's going to touch on that maybe towards the end of the presentation too.
2
but-
slides.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to jump.
No, that's okay.
Sorry, I jumped on
No,
it.
We're on the home stretch here.
Right, right.
I'll
So
hold
I-
my question for the end then.
What's that?
I'll hold my
Okay.
question for the end.
So we just talked about it briefly before, but just in terms of the shelf life, that one, I think coming at it fresh, that once you get past your second or third update, you start losing a little bit. You know, when you make these individual adjustments, you want to make sure you recalibrate. I would also hazard to guess that in the last 6 years, many of your jobs have evolved. That I would be shocked if we didn't look at this fresh and say, well, based on what we saw 6 years ago, or at that time, 8 to 10 years ago, that there's been changes. As technology is introduced, as you become a little bit leaner, and as you analyze positions. So again, the shelf life, I think we're nearing the end. We're not at the end, but we're nearing it. One of the things, and we were asked to specifically talk about this, is that the pressure at the lower end of the wage schedule. And I think by the time we get around to the next cycle, we're absolutely going to see that. We're seeing that happen now, but as I allude to in here in the report, we've seen many organizations right after the tax cuts from last year, and I'm going to stay away from all the political ramifications of that, but the reality was that the tax cuts were introduced. We saw several major banks in Wisconsin announce increases to their entry-level wage. We just recently, in the last couple of months, I think Amazon and Walgreens made announcements, and we've seen other organizations adjust their schedule. We also have, more of a trend nationwide to adjust minimum wages. In fact, I just saw one organization where, not moving to 15, but that we within our city want to see, a base pay no lower than, I think, $11 per hour. We're seeing that. But what happens, and this is something we're having some time to kind of see how this wave rides out, is that usually, especially in the private sector, that an increase in one area oftentimes can result in a decrease in others. And we saw some of the fallout with some of these, that an increase in wage results in a decrease in stock options or bonuses or hours worked or eligibility for retiree health insurance, or you can keep that loop playing. So we want to see how it plays out. This is new information, and so that being introduced into the surveys that we conduct and or subscribe to, it hasn't made their way to those surveys yet. And so again, by the time we reach that. That being said, I know John and Michelle and Mark are sensitive to, are we competitive? Are we able to recruit the talent we need into some of these entry-level jobs? And if it becomes a problem, I guarantee you the first phone call is going to be from John saying that we need to do something to address this. But we're aware of it, and we're certainly going to place it on our radar, not just here, but I think across the state, because I think it is going to make some of these entry-level jobs more and more difficult to recruit. And as you have to change the bottom level of your structure, by extension, usually it has a domino effect up into the structure of ways to make certain that you have, again, just as we're talking about the police and fire departments from a compression standpoint, some of those other things hold true as well.
And I would add, and I think Michelle has seen it already, even in her short time here, that you can see sometimes clues that might help foretell the future. And one of the things that we've seen is in our seasonal hires, it's been much more difficult for us to hire seasonal employees where we were able to get students to work for us pretty readily in the past. It's been just much more difficult now. And a lot of those jobs are on the lower end of the pay scale. So the seasonals may be the first warning sign, and then we're experiencing maybe a little more difficulty recruiting people in our lower pay ranges. So I think as that continues, we'll need to respond accordingly. And then hopefully when we do the full-blown study as we move forward, everything will get looked at in totality, because Patrick's right. Sometimes it's like a spider web with compensation. If you adjust something here, it's felt over here. So it has to really be looked at. We can make some adjustments temporarily, but it really needs to be looked at comprehensively in order to make sure that we're still honoring internal equity and all those sorts of issues that need to be evaluated.
I think we've been,
One question is, as far as entry level and so forth, is there a clearly defined career path for employees in the city of Oshkosh?
That I'll say two things about that. First of all, if I look at the generational differences, when we see some of the studies coming out, regarding the millennials and the post millennials, is that expectation of what is that career path for me? That we spent a great deal of time over the course of the last 5, both in my HR capacity and now in my consulting capacity, breaking down these levels, because in the past, a lot of these levels, I'll just pick on engineering technician, but you can insert whatever job you want. You might see a 1, 2, and 3, And the only differentiating factor was, well, 1 is entry level, a 2 is 2 years of service, a 3 is 3 years of service, but there was no meaning behind that otherwise. We are now in the phase of beginning to build those structures back up where, I'll just use the same example again, that as we're working with organizations now, well, 1 is entry level, that makes sense. A 2, we're gonna put this person in charge of projects, okay? They're responsible for, Smith Street, sidewalk, they're gonna project manage that and this, and then the 3 level is maybe they're managing the full street replacement or sidewalk replacement program, and they're helping make decisions as it relates to that. But the point is that going back and revisiting this and developing career paths with actual meaning as opposed to just time in the seat. And so I think that the expectation with most organizations is that if we're gonna have those career paths for a city, what do I get in return? And from the employee as well, what do I get in return? It has to be a mutual benefit. If it's just a matter of I've been here 2 more years, you should have a good compensation structure that accounts for that. So my point is that 1, it's demanded of the newer generations coming into the workforce, and 2, we're seeing organizations roll up their sleeves and talk about how do we actually do this where we know what we're getting in return for having this additional level of competence of that employee.
And in addition to the organizational development that we talked about earlier, these are projects that Michelle is already working on. So Michelle, you can feel free to talk about some of that if you wish.
Absolutely. I've come from private sector where, we work a lot on developing employees. We want employees to be able to progress through the organization. So whether that's up a career path specific to engineering, or if it's more general into supervision, we're looking at those. Mark and I have had some conversations about it already as to how do we keep engaging people and teaching them new skills so that they can continue to progress with us again, and through more than just one path. It might be a technical path, it might be a leadership path, and really utilizing our talent and growing them. So we are looking at job families, we're looking at opportunities for training and development, which I'm sure you'll be seeing more of in the near future as well, so that we can, again, encourage especially the millennials to grow with us rather than feeling they need to leave the organization for new opportunities.
Because I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
It shows as an employer, we really care about you and your future. And I've been with, in the private sector, companies where they reorganize. And all of a sudden, these poor people who, they started here and their aim was here, that aim is.
That career path disappears.
Disappears, and with no explanation. We just reorganized.
And I made mention of it before, but I think it bears repeating that, the more difficult jobs that we're finding to fill are your managerial, your supervisory, and your advanced professional. And your best strategy for dealing with that is growing your own talent. That if you have the ability to do so and the people with the willingness to do so, that's going to save you a lot of frustration down the road. So going down that path is absolutely the right way to go.
And I think that career path options that we're going to look at, people can say, maybe I want to change in my career for a variety of reasons, and we'll be able to demonstrate to them there are some other options for you. Because Patrick's second slide, shorter and more careers. I mean, the number of people that'll say, well, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to do something else. We find that a lot, and we just have to be able to be responsive to that, especially if we want to maintain them.
Is there burnout? Is it old-fashioned burnout, or is it just more frustration with the way things should move in this day and age?
When I talk about the younger and the different careers, at first, my first reaction when I first started looking into this information a couple years back was, oh, wait a second, these are people who are younger in their career. When I was younger in my career, I stayed 3.5 years in my first job, 2.5 in my second, and then 13 years in my third. That you find your place. So I think part of that is just the natural progression of growing up. But I think where we're starting to see the deviation is that the divergent careers, that, this phase of my life I was a social worker, this phase of my life I was a computer programmer. Two completely, I'm using, I don't know if that exists or not, or I'm sure it has happened.
Yeah.
But the reality is that people taking different career paths, not just different jobs, but different career paths, and that's what we're beginning to see evidence of. And more power. If that's where your interests fall, more power to you. But this notion, and in fact, I was just working on a presentation I'm giving in January, that this notion of come and stay a career, that, the old model, if I rewind 20 years ago, is that you would get a job with the city, with the county, or whatever it might be, and you wake up 30 years later and you're still with that organization. That's going away.
And it's a turnoff as well.
Yes.
It's not, come and stay with us for 30 years. It's like, is that a sentence? I mean, there is,
Oh, yeah.
I think there's restlessness or just,
It's doing the same old thing, but if the employee sees that I can go from this discipline to that discipline within the same organization,
Right.
I think that's what people are looking
Yeah,
for
I mean-
more now. I mean, you're younger. What's your feeling? I mean,
I think when you're younger, you're trying to figure who you are. I mean,
Absolutely.
like even when you're going to school, you don't know what you're going for. And once you graduate, sometimes you get the job and then you realize this isn't for me and they go back again. So,
I mean, more specifically, some of the programs that Michelle's working on is career ladders, trying to identify how people can move in similar kind of job families that you talked about. That's one thing. And then we talked about it at strategic planning, some sort of educational development program that we'll be asking your support on too. So that's something that is, going to be the investment to help facilitate some of these.
and I think another factor that people are switching jobs more in their 20s to 30s is because they're waiting on having children too. So when you have kids, you're kind of locked into a career a lot of times. But if you don't have kids, you got the flexibility to move around.
I think part of it, what I think most employers see in the workforce is you also have a class. You have millennials, you have the Xers, and you have the boomers. And it kind of depends on the leadership style of those that are actually own the organization or higher up management. Because if you have the baby boomers, they came from the generation that they showed their work ethic working 60 hours, 80 hours a week. The boomers or the Xers came in and that was kind of who their parents were, but yet they also have an ability to adapt to the millennials, and then millennials come in and they're kind of like, well, why should I have to work 10, 12 hours a day if I can get it done in 7? So I think that also in how a company adapts to all 3 different demographics also, I think, indicates how long somebody stays within an organization. If they're adaptable to that and to all 3 work groups, it tends to be a little bit harmonious. And if you have a different leadership who maybe they're looking for one specific thing, that's what I'm seeing with employers and in the workforce and those that are. And the other thing is, too, is that a lot of people don't talk about, because we all want to forget about the crash of the market back in 2008, 2009. So a lot of the baby boomers that were planning to retire, seen a lot of their retirement savings go. And so where the Xers and the millennials are saying, can you move out, because you were supposed to retire, but they're coming back saying, you know what? In that crash, I lost a good 7 to 10 years of my retirement. And oh, by the way, I need to stay in the workforce.
I think those are all excellent points. I think one thing that we try to do at the City of Oshkosh is, having the opportunity for employees to participate on different interdisciplinary teams, helps us kind of amalgamate some of those different employee types, if rather than having leadership dominate in whatever category they may be. If we can have those teams participate on and feel like they're involved in the decision-making process, I think it engages them and it kind of mitigates the potency of each one of those groups a little bit, because they work together toward a common solution. And I think that's something, the old thing, 2 heads are better than 1. Well, if we can engage 500 heads, they're better than certainly 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So we try to do that.
Do you have a question, Dahmer?
No, I think Ms. Osby touched on it in quite detail. I was just going to mention that I know we've been talking about inclusiveness and inclusivity over the last several years, and I believe that, a lot of times people immediately begin to think of that in terms of, ethnic or racial diversity rather than from a broader perspective of the intergenerational groups and that. So, but that it's hard to quantify and it's hard to really define those feelings of welcomeness, you know, from coming in. And so hopefully we'll be interested to hear more about this family of, what was it called again? Family of jobs? Wait,
Career ladders
Career
or job
ladders,
families.
job
but-
families.
But again, not just through a technical path in one discipline, but being able to branch people
Cross-functional.
off. Absolutely.
cross-functional.
And I agree with you when it comes to inclusiveness that I don't want to only focus on gender and ethnic background, but, you know, being able to include people of all different backgrounds, you know, whether that's, again, the millennial, the boomer, whether it's a cat or dog lover, right? I mean, we need to look at it beyond just the skin deep and how we make that environment where people want to be here, know that their opinions are important, no matter what group they might be associated with.
And one last thought too, there are a lot of boomers, I guess I'm one of those, that don't want to quit working for whatever reason. Maybe they can't, maybe they just like to work.
One of those is on the letterhead of our company.
I think
He enjoys
that
it.
there's a wealth of knowledge in some of these people, and I think as we're looking for staff, these are people who don't want 60 hours or 40 hours a week, but the skill set they bring with 20 hours could be an invaluable addition to a business or the government of the
Especially
city.
with mentoring and
Mentoring,
and
yeah.
preparing, because that wisdom.
That's the scariest part, because I shouldn't have cut you off.
No, you,
I've been doing department shadows the last few weeks with wastewater and those things, and your numbers show it right there. You've got 66 employees who are over 55. And at what point could they walk into John's door and say, I'm done? And how many of them go tomorrow, and what's that put us in a position for safety and security of the community when we lose that institutional knowledge and that institutional base that they haven't had a chance to pass on yet?
hold that for next week when we are discussing, we've got a classification in Public Works. We have two people combined 75 years of service with the city, and we're gonna lose them. And we gotta prepare for that, and we need to figure out a way to prepare for that type of thing. And you just saw them over at the treatment plant. We had a big,
All the plants, but
we had a
yeah.
big boom at the sewage treatment plant in 1978. That's 40 years ago.
Right after Act 10 in Calumet County, within 18 months, we lost, I think, 175 years of experience in our highway department. You know, that's huge. You know, when you figure it's a very small highway department to begin with, and then you're trying to replace that. So I had a conversation, just to go to your point, I don't have anything to add other than
Got
my
a great,
closing
awesome
point.
final slide.
Yeah, but I had a conversation last week with a client, and one of the strategies for dealing with the impending, baby boomers exiting the workforce is how long can you keep them in the workforce? How long can you give them, perhaps a more meaningful role? You talk about mentorship. You talk about, maybe there is more flexibility you can offer to work schedules. I remember it was early 2000s. We were putting together a PTO program for Calumet County. And we thought, okay, we're putting ourselves in a position to be more relevant to the next generation of the workforce coming in. And we had a group of, I think, 10 different employees. Some department had some, staff members. And the older employees said, hey, wait a second. I want this flexibility as well. I've got grandkids. I want to be more active in their life. Maybe I want to have, my Wednesday afternoon off to take care of, some personal activities that, allowing for that flexibility. We think we're focusing on one group of employees, and really I think everybody's kind of sitting on the sidelines. And I think this is a more global comment in general that, you think you're focusing on one area, but you're really opening the eyes to other groups to say, wait a second, this is a good thing. Flexibility and talking about meaning to a job where people who might feel locked into a career, and all of a sudden now we're looking at the job from a different angle. So all these things you're talking about, I think, can have a greater impact than just, the group that maybe you're immediately focusing on.
The magic word is grandparents. You see more and more grandparents taking care of their kids. So that I think that's a resource. You mentioned 175 years of knowledge. What would the cost be to replace that 175 years of knowledge?
You don't get it back. You don't get it back for a long time. I mean, that's just, and that was through nobody's fault. It was no massive cut to the workforce. It was just people who started pretty much at the same time in their careers.
That
It's
cycle's a
time.
lot in police and fire.
We did it last
Oh,
year.
yeah.
You added an extra position because of attrition last year. You didn't get the institutional knowledge back, but you got another body that at some point, those three hopefully will get to equaling 1.5 of those guys that retired off.
I know we could go on, and I have with Patrick many times, but that's one thing that I do appreciate about him. I mean, not only is he a compensation expert, he has just a tremendous depth as an HR director, and he understands how all these things are interwoven, and we certainly appreciate the fact that he's helped us with this study, and I think he's done a good job, and I hope it's something that you feel you can support.
Patrick, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We have a council meeting starting in 9 minutes, 8 minutes.
All right.
The Oshkosh Common Council is currently in a break. For a schedule of all GovTV programming, visit our website at oshkoshmedia.org. This is GovTV, opening accessibility and understanding of local government, helping you to be informed and involved.